Our past few episodes have explored Breakthrough Manifesto principles that help prime the mind and catalyze aha moments. Today, we delve into how these principles can impact personal, real life challenges. I'm speaking with a trailblazer who's harnessed the Breakthrough Manifesto to make real change surrounding divorce. That's right. From reimagining the paradigm of separation to redefining her life post divorce, Suzanne's journey is as inspiring as it is informative.
There are lots of different challenges in our lives where you might feel that you just have very limited options, and the options that you do see are not anything that you want. And the approach that we ultimately took was really about creating a third option, rejecting both of those status quo options, staying in an unhappy marriage or getting a traditional divorce.
That was Suzanne Vickberg, psychologist, coach, researcher, mom, and my co-author of the Breakthrough Manifesto and Business Chemistry books. After applying breakthrough thinking to find a novel divorce solution to better meet her own family's needs, Suzanne wrote another book, Divorce by Design, where she candidly shares her journey, providing invaluable insights into how she created a new path for her and her family. Today, she joins us to dissect her personal narrative and demonstrate how the principles of breakthrough and creative problem solving can be harnessed to tackle any life challenge and instigate a dramatic departure from the status quo. I'm Kim Christfort, Chief Innovation Leader for Executive Accelerators and the Deloitte Greenhouse. You're listening to Breakthrough by Design, where we chat with a diverse array of guests, from scientists to CEOs, academics to athletes, exploring what it takes to get to breakthrough. Suzanne, welcome. It's so great to have you back. Before we jump into the heart of today, I thought it would be fun to just talk about inspiration. I know I have been seeking inspiration lately coming into the new year. I'm wondering, what's been inspiring you lately?
This probably won't come as a surprise to you, Kim, but I'm a big reader. And I've actually been reading poetry lately, which is kind of new for me. There were several times in maybe the end of last year where I came across poems that just made me like stop in my tracks. I just felt really seen. And so now I've actually been looking up some of the poets who wrote things that I really enjoyed and reading some of their other poems. And I love sharing poems with people. Like when I read one that I think will make someone else feel seen, I love sharing it with them. So that's sort of a new way, I think, for me to get inspired these days.
What about just things that are bringing you joy lately? A related thing, joy versus inspiration.
I've started painting. And I'm really not very good at painting, although my daughter says I'm too hard on myself, but it sometimes turns out better than I think it's going to, which is like a fun little thing. And it's just relaxing. Sometimes I watch a video or sometimes I just like copy something. And I usually paint on very small, like postcard size, because when you're not a very good painter, you don't need a bunch of really big paintings that you've made.
Oh, that's funny. I wonder if there's a business chemistry correlation there, because I love to paint just for fun to relax, but I like bigger canvases because I feel like I have more latitude to just do broad strokes and not get into the details. So this may reflect something about us, Suzanne.
Interesting, interesting.
So, Suzanne, to start off, I think it's important to acknowledge that for most people, divorce is an unwelcome change. And it's something that maybe is uncomfortable to talk about, like many personal challenges. At the same time, divorce is something that is very common. Most people, if they haven't experienced a divorce themselves, know people who have. And yet, I think this is about a bigger story than just divorce, also. This is about a major change, a major disruption, and how you really approached it differently and designed an approach that would work for you. Suzanne, I'd love to frame this up before we get into the specifics and interesting angles you explored with your situation. What is the bottom line of this creative solution that you found?
When we decided to end our marriage, we decided that no one was going to move out. So we both remained in the home with our children 100% of the time. We see ourselves as a family. It's 14 years now since we ended our marriage. And in fact, He has gotten remarried, and his wife also lives with us and has been in the picture for most of that time now as a third parent in the situation. So we really see ourselves as a family. Even though my ex-husband and I ended our marriage, we're no longer spouses, we're not romantic partners, but we are co-parents and still a family.
It's an incredible story, Suzanne, and I'm always so inspired to hear how you've used your curiosity and your research lens to really take a different angle on all this. Tell me a little bit more about how you landed on this solution. How did you even consider it as an option?
Sure. Well, I think, in the beginning stages, it probably looked like a lot of other people who are struggling with a marriage that feels unfulfilling and unhappy, but at the same time, feeling like the alternative is destroying your family. So I really felt stuck between two options that both of which were very unappealing and unsatisfying. That's one of the reasons that this conversation is so relevant for Breakthrough and for our book, is because divorce is one such challenge, but there are lots of different challenges in our lives where you might feel that you just have very limited options, and the options that you do see are not anything that you want. And the approach that we ultimately took was really about creating a third option, rejecting both of those status quo options, staying in an unhappy marriage or getting a traditional divorce. I sort of kept turning the problem over and over and over in my mind. And I just started to feel like that's not possible that these are the only two options. Why would there be only two options? And as I started to sort of just really think about that and think about what was so unappealing, for example, about the option of getting a divorce, I started to think, well, maybe I'm making a lot of assumptions about what that has to look like. Maybe I could get a divorce and end my marriage, but maybe it doesn't have to include all the things that we usually think of. And, I just kept thinking, why does somebody have to move out? We are not in a situation where we can't stand each other or can't stand to be in the same room. It's just that we don't want to be married to each other. And as I started to kind of think through, like, I don't see why we have to live separately. We decided to try it. I moved into the guest room and we just said, we're going to do this for now and see how it turns out. And that was the beginning of it.
And one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you about your story is it is such a fantastic application, of course, of all of the Breakthrough Manifesto principles that we've been discussing. And whether you are going through a divorce or know somebody who is, or whether you're just somebody who's stuck and seem like you have limited options, it's really helpful to use these principles. Maybe you use them naturally, being the researcher and co-author of this book, and maybe starting with where you took us, which is you didn't want to accept the existing options. And so you actually lived with a problem for a bit. Can you describe a little bit what it was like to live with the problem in this situation?
Well, I had been living with it for a long time, which was uncomfortable. Um, it was actually a little bit easier to live with the problem and stay in it once I was actively working on trying to figure out what the problem actually was. And this is one of the things that I talk about in my book, that the one first most important step is to really figure out what is the problem you're solving for. And, we talk about that in the Breakthrough Manifesto too. For any problem you're trying to solve, you might think you know what it is, but if you take a step back and really start peeling the onion on what's the actual problem here, you might see that you can create a solution specifically designed for the problem you're solving, as opposed to a solution that is more generic. So in our case, when we really started peeling back the onion on what's the problem here, it allowed us to then say, well, let's not just accept like divorce full scale the way it usually looks. Like, what are the pieces of divorce that will actually help us solve the problem we have and will not oversolve for problems we don't have. So, just because we were unhappy as romantic partners doesn't mean that that was going to be solved by spending half time with our kids, right? Selling our house and getting two different spaces also didn't seem like a solution to the problem that we had. So when we stepped back and really explored that problem and examined what it was, it helped us create a solution that was much more targeted and really easier on everybody.
It's so helpful to see how you dissected essentially the aspects of your challenge and lived with the problem to figure out what to solve for. And it sounds like you also did a lot of one of our other principles, stripping away everything, with challenging some of the common assumptions that there are around divorce. What do you think are some of the biggest assumptions that you were able to challenge on this one?
Well, one of them was just that divorce itself is terrible and is a tragedy. That is perhaps the biggest one because, if you think about it, if you've either been divorced or you've met someone who's been divorced, if someone says, I'm divorced or I'm getting divorced, most people respond with, I'm sorry. And to me, there's no need to say you're sorry. I feel that my life and the life of my whole family is better off because we figured out a way to divorce in a way that works for us. And I see it as an accomplishment. So that's the first thing that we stripped away. The second was really this assumption that you have to live in separate houses because you're not married to each other. I mean, there are lots of people who live with people they're not married with, romantic partners or not. We just decided that that was sort of something that we didn't need to pay attention to. Another thing is anyone who's gone through a divorce will know that you often get asked the question when you're working through the paperwork, which is, how will you split the holidays with your children now that you're getting divorced? There's nothing wrong with asking that question, and a lot of people do want to split the holidays up, but there's an assumption underneath the question, which is that, of course, you'll be splitting up the holidays with your kids now that you're getting divorced. And we said, well, we don't want to do that. We're going to spend holidays together as a family like we always have. We'll have separate time apart in other ways, but there are lots and lots of questions that people ask and assumptions that people make that you can challenge. And when you start doing that, you discover that there are all of these other possibilities for solving the problem that you may not have thought of if you didn't spend the time to press and push on all of these questions.
Now, Suzanne, I know that those assumptions can be even more challenging because they can be so widely held. So you were probably surrounded by a bunch of cynics, and of course, silence our cynic is one of our principles. But at the same time, I know that you drew strength actually from having people around you contributing and inspiring you, which is our Enlist a Motley Crew principle. So can you explain that tension? You've got voices that are cynical and you've got voices that may offer support. How did you find a balance there?
Yeah. Oh, I love that question because it really is a tension. And there will be lots of people who will have a lot to say. But really, any big challenge you're going through, if you share with people about it, you're going to get a lot of advice. People love to give advice. And it's often very helpful to get advice. I mean, it can be a very confusing time. You're trying to figure it all out. You may go to trusted people, your loved ones, or a lawyer or a therapist. And people will have a lot to say. And people, mostly when it comes to divorce, often sound pretty similar. And what happens is the message that people get is to protect yourself now from your soon-to-be spouse. It's sort of an assumption that everybody's going to turn into someone who's trying to get as much as they can from the situation and maybe no longer care whether their spouse is going to be okay in the situation. And there's this real feeling of, oh, now we're all supposed to be against the other person. So that is something that comes up a lot. And also, in our case, there were a whole bunch of people saying, you can't do what you say you're going to do. It won't work. And even if it works for a little while, once one of you meets somebody, it's never going to work. I see it sort of as, yes, enlist a motley crew, bring a lot of people in, talk to them, but also hold their opinions lightly and know that if you want to do something different, then what you need to do is find people who might have different perspectives. That's why your crew has to be motley, not just like the same people you would also always ask. So, sometimes it's about finding people who maybe there's something unconventional about their life. Maybe you know them to be really open-minded people, or someone who can often see new possibilities where other people can't. When you add those kinds of people into the mix, you might be able to really get some people who will help you explore possibilities, as opposed to just shutting them down because people are trying to protect you and think that what you're doing sounds crazy.
It's a very interesting balance that you're describing, because you really want perspective. You want to have different takes on the situation, but you don't want judgment, or at least not too much judgment. And yet, if you lock yourself away from those perspectives, you might be missing a whole different creative take on things. I know you've also sought inspiration in other places. You shared that you love poetry. Even your ultimate solution was inspired maybe by an article that you read. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I had seen this article in the paper, a picture of two houses that were connected to each other with like a skyway on the second floor. And I just felt this like, oh my God, that's what I want. I want to have that. I want to stay connected, but also be separate. And it was one of the moments that I started thinking, first of all, is my next door neighbor's house for sale? Could I buy it and build a skyway? But like, maybe there are different ways. And there were also, there was a popular TV show about someone who had a very close relationship with her ex-husband that I used to watch and think, I really would like that. I want to get divorced too and have a close relationship with my ex-husband. I read various articles and blog posts in different places, and I would have this feeling of like, I want that, whatever it is. So I sometimes tell people, like, when you're trying to come up with something new, like a new possibility, especially if it's about something in your personal life, like, what are the lives that you hear about or the things that you see that give you this little spark of almost like envy? Like, I want that instead of what I have now. And then start really like digging in and exploring that and trying to understand, like, what is it about that that is appealing to me? And is there a way for me to create that same feeling, whatever it is, within my own life? And so there were a lot of those moments that really led me to this solution.
That's great advice, Suzanne. And it's an interesting, different take on live with a problem, in that you're not necessarily as focused on the issue in that sense. You're focused on listening to yourself and following those instincts around, where do you feel that envy? Where do you feel that desire to make change in a positive sense? And to your point, divorce doesn't have to be a tragedy. Is there a better way to craft that life? Now, I know you didn't start with your your skyway and your mixed house. I know this came in steps, and I love that angle of this story as a great example of our make a mess principle. Can you talk a little bit more about how messy this was in a good way?
Yeah, so we didn't know exactly what we were going to ultimately end up doing in the very beginning. It was, we're going to call the marriage over. We're going to continue being a family. We're going to get a little bit of extra space. So I moved into the guest room, which, by the way, was directly next door to his bedroom. And we lived that way for over a year. And at first, like, that was kind of enough of a change. We started thinking about really like, how sustainable is this? We were both trying to date and, like, explore how we could move on with that part of our lives. And so we started to think about, what could that look like? There's an approach called nesting where people often keep the kids in the house and the parents will revolve in and out instead of the other way around, which is the more traditional approach. And so for a while, I started thinking about that, like, maybe I'll get another place and I'll live in the house part of the time with the kids, and I'll live somewhere else part of the time. And that we didn't try out, but I did sort of mind experiment about it. So I took my kids. I wanted a place on a lake. They were maybe 4 and 6, and we drove to a lake so I could sort of envision what that would be like. And actually, it felt really awful. Like my kids were very uncooperative. And I started thinking about like trying to raise little kids and be moving back and forth between places while working full time and doing all this stuff. And I thought that doesn't feel good. So that was sort of a mind experiment. But then I came home that day and I went to the backyard right away. And I started envisioning now, like, what if we could add on to this house? What if we could create more space here? And so we started trying to get a loan. We hired an architect. We drew up plans. And we ultimately built this addition on the house that is now, for me, a private apartment if the doors are closed. But when the doors are open, it feels just like one big house. So there's a lot of wandering back and forth. The kids have the run of the house. If Tim, my ex, or his wife, Anna, want to come in, if the door's shut, they would knock. If it's open, they'll just come in. So once we had done that, then that's the point at which Anna moved in with us. So over time, we have just built this and evolved it. And we have all agreed that we will do it only as long as it works for all of us. So the whole thing is an experiment. I will say that we've put the addition on more than 10 years ago now, and it's still working. So it's a long running experiment that has done really well for us. But, certainly the day we decided to get divorced, did I have an image that my, soon to be ex-husband's one day wife would move in and be part of my family? No, I didn't know that's what was going to happen. It's what we created over time by trying things out.
Anybody who's interacted with people going through a divorce, you oftentimes see that people make all these decisions up front, and they're major life decisions, and they're often legal and financial decisions that are very hard to change. And yet your process allowed you the space to experiment, to prototype, and actually to go back to testing some of those assumptions that you thought you had, not just about the problem you were solving for, but for the solution you had. I was smiling as you told your story about going to the lake with the kids. I mean, you have this vision in mind of this perfect idyllic lakeside living, and then the reality of screaming children who don't want to go outside. It's a nice juxtaposition, and it's a much quicker way to come to that realization than actually investing in buying a new house.
Absolutely.
Suzanne, it seems like there's a close tie between this and our principle of getting real and your ability to truly be yourself and be authentic through this approach. Can you talk a little bit more about that reality for you and what it feels like to actually live your authentic self in this way?
I think that's one of the things about being in a marriage that's not working is it really can make it feel hard to be yourself after a while. And once we were able to say, hey, this is not working for us, I think it really allowed us both to sort of lean into our authentic selves. I also think, that one of the things that becomes really important related to getting real in trying to create a better divorce is values and really getting clear. I spent a lot of time thinking about my values and how do my values shape how I end my marriage and what it looks like after I've done so.
As you're describing this, Suzanne, it really makes me think this is a unique way to check your edge in a sense, because you're coming up with creative solutions, but those solutions are taking what is core to you, your values, but reinterpreting them at the edge in these new ways. I think it's great inspiration for everybody who's trying to think about how to be true to themselves and true to their values, but also innovate and grow beyond that comfort space.
Yeah, check your edge is such an interesting one for me as an introvert because I am pretty clear about my comfort zone in life, and it's not maybe as expansive as a lot of other people's. I like to often stay within my comfort zone. And yet here we are creating this solution in divorce that is so different from what most people do and is quite edgy, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think what's interesting about it is this solution actually felt comfortable for us, maybe because it was less of a departure from our marriage than most divorces are. Usually you're married and then you get divorced, and the divorced life is really quite different from the married life. And in this case, there were certain elements of our life that changed and our relationship to each other that changed. But overall, our lives actually stayed more the same than most people's do when they get divorced. So it was kind of like an edgy way to stay close to my comfort zone, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's an interesting take because to really check your edge and to do something innovative, it doesn't necessarily need to be completely disruptive. It could just be transformative. And so you're keeping the best parts. It is like you said, it's not a complete flip from one thing to another. It was much more of an evolution. And yet it is a result that I think most people hear your story and they say, wait, you're doing what?
Yeah. Which is why I wanted to write the book. I think it was one of the key factors that sort of made my antenna go up, because every time I talked about what we were planning to do, even from the very beginning, people had such a strong response that it was like, oh, wow. I mean, this must be really unusual. I mean, I knew it was unusual, but like, why does everybody respond so strongly to it all the time? I don't think it's that big of a leap in some ways. And I would like other people just to have the opportunity to see how it could work, because I really felt limited options when I was in a marriage that made me unhappy. And there were actually a lot of options. I just couldn't see them at the time. It's just one example of a new possibility, a different way to solve the problem of an unhappy marriage, to get a divorce, and guide people to think through whatever the problems were in their own marriage and how they might be able to come up with their own unique solution.
Suzanne, I think one of the reasons people have such a reaction when they hear your story is that they assume there's probably a ton of drama involved. How could it possibly work? Human beings are just not set up for success in that scenario. And of course, we have a manifesto principle called dial up the drama. And yet, I know you've said that's exactly not the case in your situation. And yet, that principle still applies. Can you tell us more?
Yeah. So, yeah, people always are, when they hear our story, they're like, you should have a sitcom. There should be a TV show about that. I can't ever imagine doing that. You know, what is that like? I could never live with my ex. Really, it's very boring here. There's a lot of chaos if someone rings the doorbell, because we have 3 dogs in the house. But there's just not a lot of drama that happens day to day. But the reason I think this principle is still so important, because where it comes into play is when you're thinking about, well, what do I want my future life to look like? And I ask people a question sometimes that sounds a little weird, which is, what's your dream divorce? Right? And I mean, I had a dream divorce before I ever got divorced. And it was this idea that I could get divorced, but still like be friends and still be on good terms. But imagining what your dream divorce would be and dialing up the drama by really like going in there to visualize it and think about what would it feel like, and how would it day to day work, and what are sort of the overall, again, values and just feelings of being in this, whatever it is that you think would be the best case scenario for you, I think is a place where dial up the drama really comes into play. And then just also to acknowledge that even in a good divorce, when you're trying to figure it out, there's a lot of emotions, and emotions really can get in the way of sort of rational, logical communication and problem solving. if you're not paying attention to them, if you're trying to sort of tamp them down or ignore them. It's important to obviously pay attention to what those emotions are, to work through them. Sometimes living with the problem and going a little slower, or like we did, experimenting and making a mess and not making all those decisions right up front, is really beneficial, because those emotions do cool. Emotions are real hot in the beginning and they may never go away, but they probably will cool off. It's like the marriage didn't last forever, but the divorce probably will. So you want to be making decisions about it when your head and your heart are both a little cooler.
It's great advice. Don't ignore the fact that you have emotions, but don't let them sidetrack you either. And instead, harness them to actually envision. I love it. What's your dream divorce? That can apply to anything. What's your dream job? What's your dream partnership? Tapping into that emotion in a positive way, if you're feeling stuck, can really help you to figure out where you should be heading.
Definitely.
Now, Suzanne, you've given us great examples of the manifesto principles. And I know that we said in the beginning, this is not just about divorce. It's really about any time that you are stuck and you feel like you have to choose between maybe two unsatisfactory options, about really creating alternative creative paths by looking at what you're trying to solve for, by checking those assumptions, by getting those unique perspectives and being very authentic. What are the tips and tricks that our listeners should keep in mind to try to play this out in their own lives?
The number one thing is really asking questions. Asking questions, asking questions, asking questions, and trying to understand whatever I think is true in this situation. So let's say it's about your career and you're trying to figure out, like, should I stay and chase a promotion here, or should I leave? Still the same question: should I stay or should I go? Or should I leave and go somewhere else to try a new opportunity? And there are certain things that you probably believe about both of those scenarios. Oh, well, if I stay, it will take me 3 years to get the promotion, or I'd have to do this certain type of role to get the promotion. If I go to the other place, I have other beliefs. And asking yourself whether you actually know for a fact that all those things are true, or whether they might be assumptions, because we are so often making assumptions about all kinds of things. It's just what humans do, right? And our brains are designed to take shortcuts and sort of give us an opportunity to move ahead quickly on things. But taking a step back and just checking with yourself, is this really true? Talking to someone else who, remember, we will hold their opinions lightly, but do you think this is really true? And what if we challenged this? And what could another alternative be? I think that is the most important thing anybody can do. And then the other part that's related to that is just being very intentional about creating what you want, whether that's in your divorce, whether it's in your marriage that is staying intact, whether it's in your career, whether it's in the habits that you form in your life, whether it's how you relate to your kids, whatever it is, being intentional and not sort of going along and doing what seems obvious, or where the path you're already on seems to be pushing you, but stopping often and saying, is that where I actually want to go? Is that how I actually want to do this? What would my dream be related to whatever this thing is? My dream career, my dream relationship with my kids, my dream habits.
Suzanne, thank you so much for sharing. So, if you take your tips and approaches and apply them to this next stage of your life, do you have a change on your horizon that you're looking to get to breakthrough on?
I absolutely do. So I mentioned earlier that my oldest went to college this year. My youngest will be home for about another year and a half, and then she'll be going to college, presumably. And so I'm looking at, like, wow, what is that going to look like, right? I'm going to not have kids at home anymore. And yes, they'll come to visit, but they will not be living here full time. And so I've got like a whole next stage to create, which I'm excited by. I will say right this minute, it's hard for me to envision. I just see this like blinking red light that says my daughter goes to college. And I haven't figured out how to see past it yet, but I do know that as it gets closer, I will definitely be sitting down and spending some real time envisioning what I want that stage of my life to look like so that I can get to work on creating it.
Well, we will wish you much luck on that journey, Suzanne. That is a big, big pivot point for sure, and one that no doubt will come with very interesting solutions. So, last question, Suzanne, that of course we ask everyone on the show, but given that you are a co author, I would love your personal definition of what breakthrough means to you.
Yeah, I think if I strip it down and just get to essentially what it is, it's really about getting unstuck or getting new clarity about something that you've been unable to see clearly before.
Suzanne, thank you so much for sharing your personal story. I know that I've heard you talk about this before, I've read your book, and yet the angles on this story are just so revealing around what is possible if you put your mind to it and, to your point, start asking questions and getting curious.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about it, to get real. I love when the various parts of my life collide with each other. So being able to talk about the Breakthrough Manifesto and Divorce by Design at the same time is a real treat for me.
Suzanne, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm so glad we were able to bring Suzanne back on the podcast to share her personal breakthrough story. Her unique example highlights how the Breakthrough Manifesto principles can help make real change, not only in business, but in life. Her story reminds us that just when you think there are only one or two unappealing options, you should look again. Change your mindset to challenge the status quo, and perhaps design your own, better option. If you want to learn more about Suzanne and other leaders who are sparking transformative innovation in their fields, visit breakthroughmanifesto.com. Thank you for listening to Breakthrough by Design, where we believe everyone has the potential for breakthrough.
This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, go to deloitte.com/about.